heard about the forest fires surrounding Yosemite National Park. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to yield back my time but recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman Hastings for organizing this discussion and for his work on H.R. 1526, the Restoring Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act. This act takes on a poignant and crucial importance to my district in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, where the Yosemite Rim fire continues to burn through nearly 400 square miles of forest land. For years, foresters have warned us that the excess timber will come out of the forests one way or another. It will either be carried out or it will be burned out, but it will come out. For generations, we carried the excess timber out of our forests through sound forest management practices, leaving room for the remaining trees to grow healthy and strong. We had far less frequent and less intense forest fires, healthy trees that were disease-resistant and pest-resistant, and a healthier watershed, as well as a thriving economy. But today, extremist environmental regulations have driven that harvest down by more than 80% in the Sierras in the past 30 years. We now consign the forests to a policy of benign neglect. And rather than harvesting a small percentage of the trees to keep our forests healthy and fire-resistant, we are watching more than 400 square miles of the Sierra Nevada incinerated. If we had just harvested a small fraction of those trees, it's quite possible that we could have spared the Sierras from the conflagrations that are now feeding on excessive fuels. And it's also likely we could have snuffed out those fires almost immediately after they started. A generation ago, small harvesting crews operated throughout the mountains, and they moved along well-maintained timber roads. When a fire first broke out, it took no time for a crew with a bulldozer to get to that fire and stop it before it got out of control. Today, those crews are gone, the roads are in disrepair, and so fires that a generation ago consumed just a few acres now consume hundreds of thousands of acres. The result of these misguided policies is now clear and undeniable. Economically devastated communities, closed timber mills, unemployed families, overgrown forests, overdrawn watersheds, jeopardized transmission lines, rampant disease and pestilence, and increasingly intense and frequent forest fires. That is the story of the towns throughout the Sierra Nevada, once thriving and prosperous communities that have been devastated by these policies. This is not environmentalism. True environmentalists recognize the damage done by overgrowth and overpopulation, and they recognize the role of sound, sustainable forest management practices in maintaining healthy forests. If there is any doubt of the connection between the reduction of timber harvesting and the increase in acreage incinerated by forest fires, I ask you to look at this chart that shows the board feet of timber harvested from our public lands since 1983 and the forest acreage destroyed by fire. There is nothing subtle about these numbers. As the timber harvest has declined, the acreage destroyed by fire has increased contemporaneously and proportionally. It is either carried out or burned out, and at the moment it's being burned out. They say there isn't enough money for forest thinning, and yet we used to have no problem keeping our forests thinned and healthy when we sold commercially viable timber. The problem is that if they take place at all, timber harvests are restricted to small diameter trees with no commercial value. I mean, can you imagine a fishery or a wildlife policy limited to taking only the smallest juveniles of the species? Thus, the U.S. Forest Service, which once produced revenues through timber sales, now consumes revenues, and even that isn't enough to maintain the acreage the government owns and controls. The mountain communities that once thrived economically are now economically prostrate, with unemployment levels that rival those of Detroit. This act is long overdue. By streamlining regulations and refocusing the Forest Service's mission on sound forest management practices, H.R. 1526 will mean environmentally healthy forests and economically healthier communities. Ironically, just 2 weeks before the Yosemite Rim fire broke out, Congressman Nunez and I hosted a public meeting on a proposal by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that would add more restrictions on nearly 2 million acres of the Sierras. Our expert witnesses warned urgently of the fire dangers these policies that have created. Yet these warnings were actually ridiculed by leftist newspapers like the Sacramento Bee. How sad. 2 weeks later, the Yosemite Rim fire was burning out of control. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of my district, I want to thank the gentleman from Washington for this important reform. I only wish it had come in time to prevent the environmental devastation we are now suffering this summer in the Sierras. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013. The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 48 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to control this next 48 minutes as we explain how significant this secure rural school fix is and how important it is that we do something on a program that, quite frankly, is not sustainable. So this time I'd like to recognize, if not the father, the godfather of secure rural schools. Gentleman from Oregon, his state is impacted significantly by this program. It is a significant issue to the school kids of Oregon, and Mr. Walden of Oregon is someone who has talked about this for many years and knows the significance and the importance of this particular issue. So I gladly yield to the gentleman from Oregon to explain his take on this secure rural schools issue.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Utah, the chairman of the Forestry Subcommittee, a subcommittee that a number of years ago I had the great privilege and honor to chair when we passed legislation, as we're going to do in this House once again, to not only make America's great forests healthy, but also then to stop the devastation that we heard from the gentleman from California. We have so much work to do to continue the legacy of real environmentalism, which is healthy forests and healthy communities. When President Theodore Roosevelt created the great forest reserves back in 1905, thereabouts, he said they have to be in partnership with the communities, and the communities have to be supportive of this. And the great purpose of this creation of forest reserves, in a speech he gave in your home state, as a matter of fact, in Utah, I believe, was wood for wood making, for home building, water for agriculture, which means the preservation of healthy forests. In the real term, preservation, which is what I want. Not what we're seeing in Yosemite National Park and the surrounding areas, what was it, 400 square miles of devastation. Not what we saw in Oregon this summer, where the smoke was so thick in the Rogue Valley that they had to cancel performances at the Shakespeare Theater. The restaurants literally shut down. The people had to wear masks. I called into the call center of one of the phone companies, and the attendant there said to me, he said, "It's smoky in here inside the building." This is not what we want out of our forests. It's not what our taxpayers want. It's not what the school children want, because, you see, we've lost the jobs. We've lost the revenue from the jobs. We've got sheriffs in counties in my district that now have maybe one deputy. We had situations of violence, 9/11 calls. A woman was being attacked and basically told by the 9/11 folks, "We don't have anybody to send. Can you tell him to go away?" You can't make this stuff up. I thank Chairman Hastings, Chairman Bishop, others for bringing this bill forward. Let me tell you what it means in a state like mine. In 2012, the Oregon Department of Forestry, in collaboration with other state and federal agencies, issued a report to Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber, stating that over the 20-year period from 1980 to 2000, wildfires in eastern Oregon burned approximately 553,000 acres with an average fire size of 26,000 acres. Over the last 10 years, in the same area, it's burned 1 million acres, averaging 93,000 acres in size. That means wildfires have tripled in size in the last 30 years. Not all of those are in forests. Some of them are grasslands. But the point is, it's out of control. and it's very, very deadly and expensive, and it's unacceptable. The Oregon Forest Resources Institute reported that since 1990, the timber harvest from federal forest lands in the great state of Oregon have dropped by more than 90%. 90% reduction since 1990 in harvest of timber off federal lands. In fact, 60% of Oregon's forest land is owned, controlled, but not really managed by the federal government. It now contributes less than 12% of the state's total timber harvest. 60% owned by, controlled by the federal government, 12% of timber harvest. And what does that mean for timber-dependent communities? Counties that are have like 50, 60, 70% federal ownership. My friend who taught school knows you don't have a tax base. And now you don't have jobs because now you're not doing harvest. You can't turn and entice some big company to come in. They don't. This is a forested rural area, long way from freeways in most cases, but not all. And so what does that mean? 9 of the 20 counties I represent face double-digit unemployment today. 9 of 20. 16 of the 20 counties I represent have more than 14% of their populations living in poverty in America. 14% in 16 of the 20 counties. Here's a chart that shows what's happening. It shows mill closures in Oregon over the last 30 years. We've lost 3/4 of our mills and 30,000 mill jobs. And just recently we lost another one in Josephine County. The Rough and Ready mill closed after nearly 100 years. The owners were ready to invest $2 million in upgrades, and they said we can't count on a timber supply off the federal ground that surrounds them. There went 87 jobs. I want to show you another picture. I've used it before over the years. It's indicative of what happens in a fire. This is Caleb and Ashley after the Egley fire, which burned 140,000 acres in Harney County, 2007. It just shows the devastation, these young children out there. And what does it mean for our kids? The chairman asked about that. The Oregon Department of Education says 60% of the school children in the county where this fire occurred are eligible for free and reduced lunch. There's poverty all over the West, and there's a way to end that and produce jobs and revenue and have healthy forests rather than what we see today. The chairman's bill would require foresters to look at sustainable yield. A forest could produce and then only seek to harvest half of that, of the sustainable yield, and only on land that's suitable for timber harvest. It says if you're going to appeal a plan, you had to at least be involved in the process. We put that in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act that passed this body overwhelmingly and I think passed the Senate. Huge support signed by then President Bush into law. It's had great effect but limited in terms of what we need to do, but it had that provision in there. It strikes a balance. You need to participate in the process in order to have a right to appeal. It includes a 1-year bridge payment. This gets to your schools issue for the counties who currently have lost or will lose their funding for emergency services, for roads, and for schools in the secure rural school side. This is a bridge. This is a bridge to put people back to work in the woods when coupled with active management. This is balance. This is balance. Now, the bill also has an Oregon-specific provision. Not everything I'd necessarily do if I could write it on my own, but you know what? You don't get that process here. We put together a good plan with Representatives DeFazio and Schrader. We've worked through our differences. We forged a balanced plan that would create thousands of new jobs, create or save up to 3,000 jobs in Oregon in these very unique lands called the O&C lands. It ensures the health of these lands for future generations. It provides long-term management and certainty of funding for our local services and schools and roads and law enforcement that lie within these counties. According to Governor Kitzhaber's O&C lands report, it would generate $120 million per year in county revenue. We don't come back here to the federal taxpayer and say, give us another check, give us another handout. We say, let us manage our own lands and do it under Oregon State Forest Practices Act, which is one of the leading environmental laws in the country for balance, for sustainable forest health and management. Do it under that, and we'll create the jobs and save them. We'll create the revenue for our schools. And let me tell you about the protections that you'll get. It provides Activities near streams, lakes, and wetlands must include water quality protection, something we all agree on. Wildlife, trees, and down logs have to be left in most large clear-cut areas. Clear-cut sizes are limited to 120 acres. Now, some will say, oh my gosh, 120 acres. Let me tell you that the Douglas Complex fire that burned this summer burned 48,000 acres. If there isn't a more destructive clear-cut than that, I don't know what it is. And you know what? After it burns, there's no requirement they go in and replant. If you harvest 120 acres, you're required to go in and replant, and those trees have to survive. And you go in right away. Let me show you what happens after a fire to the environment. There's no stream setback here. Fire knows no bounds. Our legislation says you can't harvest near that, near a stream. You have to have setbacks. We believe in the environment. This is what you get when you don't manage. You see, lack of action has an impact in a dynamic forest environment. Doing nothing doesn't mean the forest gets better. It means it gets overcrowded, overstocked, and when you get fire, and we'll always have it, it just won't burn naturally anymore. It'll blow up like my friend and colleague from California's experienced in the Yosemite fire. And like we've experienced all over the West this summer, and will every summer thereafter. The Forest Service now spends more fighting fire than anything else. Yeah, it changed the name of the U.S. Fire Service. We got to get back to managing these lands, and this legislation does that. I thank the committee for its incredible work. I thank you for bringing this to the floor. I look forward to voting for it when it comes to the floor. And together, we'll get back to proper, thoughtful, constructive management of our federal forests. We'll take care of that trust the people put in us to take care of their lands. And we'll take care of the people as well. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his comments here. We have heard now from 3 members from the West Coast, one from California, one from Oregon and Washington, who have explained the situation and how this particular act is indeed a solution to the problems that those West Coast states are finding in their forestry efforts. But this also impacts the interior of this country. So I'd like to yield a few minutes to the representative from the state of Montana, who represents the entire state of Montana, to explain how this has an impact on interior states' forests as well as the coastal states' forests. Recognize Representative Daines to explain what's happening in his state.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Utah, and I thank the chairman for reserving this hour for this very important issue, saving our national forests and our forested communities, which is very important to my home state of Montana. H.R. 1526, Restoring Healthy Forests and the Healthy Communities Act, is important to Montana because many of our counties in Montana rely on the forest economy, or at least the relics of what used to be one. You see, several decades ago, Montana forests supported local timber jobs and provided a steady revenue stream for our counties and schools. In fact, I remember growing up when I was riding in the back seat, Mom and Dad in front in the station wagon, and I would be in the back with my sisters. We'd watch logging trucks drive up and down our highways, and our counties enjoyed the benefits of the receipts from timber sales it would use to help support our schools. But today, as I now drive around the state representing the state of Montana, most of our forest counties struggle with unemployment. In fact, Lincoln County, the most northwest county of my state, which is comprised mostly of national forest land, it used to generate timber jobs. They now face double-digit unemployment. The Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest faces a very high mortality rate due to beetle kill. The tragedy here is we drive all over the state this time of year. We're seeing forest fires on one hand and then standing dead timber on the other that's died because of beetle kill. And we can't even go in and harvest the dead trees, which we have a couple years to do so because of the onerous process here on our national forest. Inflexible and outdated federal laws like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act have imposed a huge administrative burden on federal agencies, which limit our timber industry's access to wood and ultimately have resulted in the mismanagement of our forests, allowing places that we love to recreate instead to burn up in smoke. And when they burn up in smoke, as the gentleman from Oregon mentioned, it threatens our watersheds as well. In fact, so far, over 100,000 acres in Montana have burned this year. The number of large fires has been as high as 5 just this week. My son last year played high school football his senior year. We had Friday Night Lights, high school football games in Montana canceled because of air quality, because of forest fires. Laws like NEPA and the Endangered Species Act are often the basis of lawsuits. And these aren't filed by the rank-and-file Montanans who are working to collaborate to improve access to our national forest, but they're filed by fringe extreme groups to halt healthy timber management projects that could help prevent these fires and, importantly, create hundreds of jobs. In fact, in one of our hearings in our committee, a top national forest official, Deputy Chief Jim Hubbard, said litigation has played a huge role in blocking responsible timber sales in Montana and other Region 1 states, including projects supported by collaborative groups consisting both of timber as well as conservation leaders. To quote Mr. Hubbard, he said this: "It has virtually shut things down on the national forest." As the gentleman from Oregon mentioned, the numbers in Montana are the same. Timber harvests are down 90% on our federal lands from where they were when I was growing up. Mr. Chairman, something must be done, and I'm glad to have joined you in introducing this most important bill. H.R. 1526 will help revitalize the timber industry throughout Montana and create thousands of good, high-paying jobs. It also tackles beetle kill, protecting our environment for future generations and reducing the threat of catastrophic wildfires in Montana. The Restoring Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act will cut the red tape that has held up responsible forest management and timber production. And it also includes comprehensive reforms to discourage and limit the flood of frivolous appeals and litigation. It requires the Forest Service to increase timber harvests on non-wilderness lands now that it will have much needed latitude to do the work it knows how to do. This improved management will protect the health of our forests, the health of our watersheds, the safety of our communities, and allow jobs to return to the timber industry. In addition, the legislation restores the federal government's commitment to provide 25% of timber sales receipts to timber counties. It extends the Secure Rural Schools program pending the full operation of the new timber program. SRS has provided crucial stopgap funding to timber counties after timber sales and the corresponding receipts after they plunged in recent decades. It's the taxpayer now who's funding that gap, when instead we could have timber industry cutting down trees and supplying jobs and supplying revenue to support our schools. Recently, we welcomed Chuck Rohde, the Vice President and General Manager of F.L. Stoltz Land and Lumber in Columbia Falls, Montana. He came back to Washington, D.C. as a witness for a House Natural Resources hearing on forest and fire management. During the hearing, Chuck perfectly summed up the challenges we face. He said, and I quote, "This is a nonpartisan, non-regional issue. It's simply the case of doing the right thing to manage our public forests. If we don't, Mother Nature is going to do it for us, and when she does it, it's uncontrollable and it's catastrophic." Mr. Chairman, I could not have conveyed our challenges any better than that. We all know too well how devastating wildfires can be to our communities and our local economies. I urge passing the Restoring Healthy Forests and Healthy Communities Act, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the remarks from the gentleman from Montana. Very few people realize that the federal government actually owns 1 out of every 3 acres in this country, but it is disproportionate. So of the 13 western states, 54% of the land mass is actually owned by the federal government. The 33 states east of Denver only have 4% of their land, east of the western states, which simply means no one actually east of Denver quite understands how this relationship necessarily works. It also means that the unfortunate truth is, as we've already heard, is that private and state forests are today healthier than the federal forest system. But those of us in the West realize this firsthand because those are our neighbors, those are the areas that surround our communities. So I'm glad to hear from the next 2 speakers who will be talking from Colorado. The first one is the gentleman from Colorado Springs, who is on the Resource Committee, and he's going to explain the significant situation that they find in Colorado with our forest health situation. I yield to Mr. Lamborn.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Utah. It's great to serve on the committee as a subcommittee chairman with him, and we serve with Chairman Doc Hastings, who's doing a great job on these resource issues. The bill, H.R. 1526, the Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act, is a long-term solution to help put hard-working Americans back to work and ensure that these rural counties have a stable source of revenue to help pay for schools and teachers. It was introduced by my friend and colleague, Representative Scott Tipton of Colorado, and I am a co-sponsor. Over a century ago, the federal government made a promise to actively manage our forests and share 25% of the revenues generated from timber sales with counties containing national forest land. This is funding that rural counties depend on to help fund vital services such as education and roads. But the federal government has failed to uphold this commitment and has cut back on active management of our national forests. This lack of active forest management not only deprives counties of revenue to help fund schools and roads, but also inhibits job creation and makes our national forests increasingly susceptible to wildfires and invasive species. Currently, there are over 21 active large wildfires burning right now in 8 states. Over 406,000 acres are burning, with only 2 of the 21 fires contained. This year to date, there have been over 35,000 fires with almost 4 million acres burned. Last year, the tragic Waldo Canyon fire occurred on federal land in my Colorado district, claiming 2 lives and destroying almost 500 homes. H.R. 1526 will help improve forest health and prevent catastrophic wildfires by allowing greater state and local involvement in wildfire prevention on federal lands. It will help improve local forest management by allowing counties to actively manage portions of national forest land. Restoring active management of our national forests would ensure a stable, predictable revenue stream for counties and schools. Active management would also promote healthier forests, reduce the risk of wildfires, and decrease our reliance on foreign countries for timber and paper goods. I want to thank the gentleman for his leadership on this issue, and I yield back.
Since Mr. Lamborn has already introduced the concept of what's taking place in Colorado and the bill from Mr. Tipton, let us turn now to Mr. Tipton of Colorado to also explain the significance and why he actually did that particular bill.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, and certainly appreciate your leadership on this issue along with Chairman Hastings. My colleague had just described some of the challenges that we've been facing in Colorado. I'd like to be able to expand upon that. Not long ago, I was at the Incident Command Centers in Monte Vista, Colorado, on the east side of the Rockies, and also in Pagosa Springs on the west side of the Rockies. To be able to visit the Incident Command Centers trying to deal with the West Fork Complex fire. How big is the fire? 170 square miles and counting. We aren't talking 170 acres. We're talking 170 square miles of forests in my district. The challenges that this is going to place in terms of being able to deal with endangered species, in terms of water quality, in terms of tourism and the economy in western Colorado can probably not yet be numbered. That is why the Restoring Healthy Forest Act is a bill whose time has come. The National Interagency Fire Center reported this week that there have been over 35,000 plus fires in the United States in 2013 alone. Devastating bark beetle infestation, prolonged drought conditions, unnaturally dense forests, these have all combined with ineffective forest management, and they've combined for a devastating fire season. These factors have led to a significant increase in the magnitude and number of wildfires in the country over the past decade. So far this year, 3.9 million acres have already burned, and these figures continue to grow with 21 active large wildfires. The property damage and costs associated with these wildfires is tremendous. And to date, the Forest Service has already spent over $20 billion in fire suppression alone. In 2012, the Forest Service spent only $296 million on hazardous fuel reduction, whereas they spent $1.77 billion on wildfire suppression at that same time. Part of this is a planning process. We have dealt with the leadership in the Forest Service. They've talked about computer models, which their own folks are telling us simply don't work. We have to be able to get in and effectively manage these forests, to be able to treat them in a responsible way, to be able to build for our communities, and to be able to make sure that our children are able to see the same forests that we grew up living in. The cost of proactive, healthy forest management is indeed far less than the cost of wildfire suppression. When it comes to our forests, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But instead of ramping up forest management efforts and addressing hazardous conditions in the West, the Interior Department has proposed to cut the budget by 48% for fuel reductions in 2014. And Forest Service has proposed reducing this proactive management by a further 24%. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have expressed outrage at this approach and further reducing funding for hazardous fuels. Under the current management system, a cumbersome regulatory framework has further inhibited active forest management, while excessive litigation has obstructed projects that would prevent devastating wildfires, protect our vital water supplies and precious species habitats. The status quo is not working, and immediate action is needed to be able to fix this broken system. Our forest management package, H.R. 1526, would allow greater state and local involvement in wildfire prevention on federal lands in order to expedite hazardous fuel reduction projects and reduce litigation in doing so to help restore sustainable timber harvests, create jobs, and provide reliable sources of revenue for rural education and infrastructure. H.R. 1526 addresses the shortfall also in county revenue for schools and critical services caused by a lack of timber harvest by requiring the Forest Service to produce at least half of the sustainable annual yield of timber required under the 1908 law and share 25% of those receipts with our rural counties. In order to meet this goal while providing for healthy forests, the bill continues local management framework by directing the Forest Service to prioritize hazardous fuel reduction projects proposed by governors, affected counties, and tribes. To expedite locally based forest health projects, this package builds on the positive streamlining procedures implemented under the Bipartisan Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003. I'm pleased to be able to work with Chairman Bishop and Chairman Hastings on this bill. It's time that we stand together to be able to return health to our forests in a proactive, a responsible, and a positive way. H.R. 1526 accomplishes that goal. With that, I yield back.
I thank the last two speakers from Colorado who explained the situation that they are facing within their states on federal forest land. And before we turn to somebody from the east who gets what we're talking about here, let's continue with the backbone of the Rocky Mountains by turning some time over to the representative from the state of Wyoming, Ms. Lemus, to explain how this impacts her state. Ms. Lemus?
Chairman, and I also thank Chairman Hastings of the Natural Resources Committee for bringing this important legislation to the attention of the American people, especially after this tremendous fire season that we've had in the West for the past 3 or 4 years, where we have lost valuable natural resources, jobs, wildlife, livestock, people, houses. It is an unnecessary devastation. It always amazes me when we would bring about legislation to address regional haze that has no environmental impact other than to reduce the view sheds or the damage to the view shed, when the damage to the view shed is being caused by our inattentiveness in managing our national forests. I want to talk, Mr. Chairman, about forest health and the benefits of logging to having healthy forests, vibrant wildlife, and clean water and air. The air is cleaner when the West is not on fire. The water is cleaner when protected from the ash that goes down the hills into the streams, choking the oxygen out of our streams, which then in turn kills our fish. That reduces fishing opportunities and it reduces a vibrant fish population. In addition to providing clean air by lack of fire, clean water due to lack of fire, by logging, we can actually have more vibrant, widespread wildlife habitat and water for that habitat. When we log and do it in a manner that preserves natural contours in our forests, we can have high mountain meadows with forages that will keep elk, deer, and other species on those high mountain meadows longer in the year, thereby providing habitat for a vibrant, healthy, diverse ungulate population and the species that share that ecosystem habitat. So it's good for wildlife. Furthermore, it's good for the health of the forests themselves, because if you would look, for example, at the Medicine Bow National Forest and the Route National Forest across the border in Colorado, these two forests have been absolutely denuded of lodgepole pine by the bark beetle, with the exception of the young trees in the areas that have previously been logged. The healthy areas of the Medicine Bow National Forest in Wyoming and the Route National Forest in Colorado are the areas that were previously logged, because there's a diversity of the age of the trees, thereby having a young, more resilient, healthy tree intermingled with stands of medium maturity and high maturity trees. The combination of the old growth, the medium maturity trees and the young trees makes for a more vibrant, healthy forest that can better withstand an onslaught like the bark beetle epidemic that has devastated so much of the Intermountain West. So we've addressed clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat through the opportunity for high mountain meadows, and we've addressed the health of the trees themselves. And all this can happen while we have jobs in logging, while we have opportunities for revenues for schools. The point here is we're all part of this ecosystem. The people, the animals, the air, the water, the trees, all can benefit by this bill. This is a common sense solution that has taken Americans decades to understand and appreciate the importance of, but that has never been more apparent than it was this summer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important dialogue. I yield back.
Appreciate the gentlelady from Wyoming being with us and talking about the concepts that are going on and what we can do for a future. If I could, Mr. Speaker, you know, at the turn of the century, the 20th century, the so-called progressive era, there was a paradigm shift that took place in the United States in which the government decided to basically keep all of the land. It was based on three premises. First is the West had to be protected from itself. The second is only somebody in Washington, D.C. would have the vision to make decisions that could impact the rest of the nation. And if there was ever a conflict between what local leaders or local officials wanted and what D.C. wanted, D.C. obviously had the better advantage. The result of that is, as you have heard from the people here today, that our forest system is not as healthy as it used to be or ought to be, that communities that relied upon the timber industry to survive, the school systems in those areas that relied upon the timber industry to survive have been decimated. And our solution as a Congress and as an administration is simply to find a temporary payment to these solutions with actually no revenue source to make them permanent. What we have now done is, since 2000, when Secure Rural School program started, is spend $6 billion that have come from the pockets of those who live in the East to fund a temporary program. Well, what we actually need is a long-term solution that works, that puts people to work, that finds a real source of funding for education services, and provides a real solution for what we need. A solution that will provide for healthy forests, a solution that will provide for vibrant communities and for the support of our public school system. And that is indeed what this proposal for the Secure Rural School program attempts to do. Mr. Speaker, about 20 years ago, a former Democrat member of this House who is now part of Senate leadership, I realize that's an oxymoron, Senate leadership, but he was here and he gave an impassioned speech upon this floor that dealt with the controversial decision of Major League Baseball about the potential of switching to aluminum bats. And as that representative from Illinois, who is now a Senator, rose, he said, "Mr. Speaker, I rise to condemn the desecration of a great American symbol." Now, I'm not talking about flag burning. I'm referring to the baseball bat. Several experts tell us that wooden baseball bat is doomed to extinction. Please do not tell me that wooden bats are too expensive. Please do not try to sell me on the motion that metal clubs will make better hitters. If we forsake the great Americana of broken bat singles and pine tar, we will certainly have lost our way as a nation. So his conclusion was simply this: I do not want to hear about saving trees. Any tree in America would gladly give its life for the glory of a day at home plate. As much as I agree with his statements, I'd like to take his comment one step further and say that not only would any tree in America gladly give its life for the glory of a day at bat at home plate, but any tree in America would gladly be overjoyed to give its life to help fund the education of our kids. And the solution is we don't need all trees to provide the bats or the education funding. Just some of the trees. In fact, if by not cutting them all, you actually save and improve the health of the forest. But if you don't do it, we lose these trees to fire. And every burned tree is a burned baseball bat, and that is not good for the psyche of this particular country. Mr. Speaker, I would like to turn the time of this special order over to Mr. Thompson of Pennsylvania for the management, so that he may speak and also introduce a couple more speakers that we have still to talk about this vital issue of secure rural schools and how this House has finally come up with a solution, a long-term, lasting solution to this particular problem.
Does the gentleman yield back his time?
I'll yield back to the chair for the purpose of yielding to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman yields back.
For the purpose of yielding the remainder of the time to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I'm just calculating.
Just go.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 12 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Bishop, Chairman Hastings. As an individual from Pennsylvania, from the eastern portion of the United States, I do get it. This is a problem that obviously, as you've heard from my colleagues from the western part of the country, is devastating there. It's devastating in communities in the Pennsylvania 5th Congressional District. We have the Allegheny National Forest there. I have 4 counties, schools, municipalities who struggle because of a failed policy in terms of forest management. They struggle economically. When we do not have healthy forests, we do not have healthy communities. And so I stand here very appreciative to Chairman Hastings' work and certainly supportive of H.R. 1526. As chairman of the Agriculture Committee's Forestry Subcommittee, I continually point out that the Forest Service is housed within the USDA rather than the Interior, and was done so for very specific purposes. This decision was made long ago because our national forests were intended for multiple use. The most important function of that mission is to properly manage these forests and grasslands in order to retain the ecological health of those resources for sustained economic and recreational use. Now, you can't adequately manage a forest without harvesting timber. Just look to our private and state forests to see how to manage a forest cost-effectively and environmentally responsibly. National forest lands, when managed correctly, will be more ecologically healthy and economically beneficial to the local communities. Representing a forested district and as an outdoorsman, I've been very alarmed at how precipitously our annual harvests have dropped off in the past 20 years. Between 1960 and 1989, the Forest Service was harvesting roughly 10 to 12 billion board feet per year. Since the early 90s, the annual harvest across Forest Service lands fell below 2 billion board feet and hit its bottom in 2002 at 1.7 billion feet. This is about one-fifth of what they've been harvesting in an average year. Now, we have seen firsthand the economic impacts of reducing our harvesting levels in national forests. Under long-time federal law, 25% of the timber receipts generated on national forests are required to be returned to the county of origin. The purpose of this is that since there is no tax base there for local government, timber receipts were to provide a consistent source of revenue to the counties to be used for schools, police, and local expenses. In 2000, this lack of timber dollars plummeted so low that Congress created the now expired Secure Rural Schools program to make up for the loss of the county revenues in the national forest lands. This program simply would not have been needed if the federal government was keeping its promise to these rural areas by managing and harvesting the appropriate amount of timber. In the Allegheny National Forest, located in my district, we have slightly inched up in meeting the recommended level of harvest, but we are still nowhere near where we need to be. And this is especially true across almost every other national forest around the country, where they typically are generating only a few percent of the recommended level. Too little harvesting will have a significant impact on overall forest health. Decreased timber harvesting means more dead trees and more highly flammable biomaterials that do little more than serve as fuel for wildfires. According to the Forest Service, the instances of wildfires each year have actually decreased in recent years. However, fires that we've been seeing recently are much more intense than they have been in past years. Why? The reason is because the increased flammability in the forest is a result of materials that have been accumulated and not removed through management activities. According to the U.S. Forest Service, 65 to 82 million acres of forest land are at high risk of wildfires. Last year, wildfires burned 9.3 million acres, while the U.S. Forest Service only harvested approximately 200,000 acres. This means that 44 times as many acres burned as were responsibly managed and harvested. As an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1526, I want to applaud Chairman Hastings for his leadership and introduction of the bill. This legislation will provide responsible timber production on forest lands and does so in areas specifically identified by the agency. Access and retaining the multiple-use mission of the Forest Service is paramount to ensuring that our rural forest communities continue to flourish and be viable. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to recognize my good friend, Western Caucus colleague, Mr. Pierce.
Thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for yielding and for his work on behalf of H.R. 1526. New Mexico is the home to multiple national forests. We see firsthand the effect of our National Forest Service policy. Last year, the middle of the year, a fire broke out. It was about 4 acres for 2 or 3 days. The Forest Service's policy basically was let it burn. They let it burn for 3 or 4 days, had enough people to swat it out with whisk brooms, when suddenly the winds got up, as they do in New Mexico always, and blew that fire into 10,000 acres almost immediately, started burning down homes. 255 homes burned. It's at that point we began to speak publicly about the Forest Service policies that would create infernos in our western forests. Formerly, we had a policy in the Forest Service of the 10 a.m. rule. That was, if you get a fire, you put it out by 10 a.m. tomorrow. If you're not successful by 10 a.m. tomorrow, then it's 10 a.m. the next day. You dedicate all the resources you can to putting out the fire. Those policies have been amended by current Forest Service Chief Tom Tidwell into saying that we're going to let them burn. We're watching right now, wondering if the sequoias will survive this Forest Service policy. Many of the forests in New Mexico and the West are not surviving. Hundreds of millions of acres are at risk every year. It's not a matter of if they will burn, but when. As we talked publicly about Forest Service management policies during that fire, Then we started getting calls from individuals around the country who had retired out of the Forest Service saying, yes, keep talking. We, as retired professionals, disagree with the current philosophies in the Forest Service. We invited one of those 30-year employees, Bill Dare, into our district to run a congressional study and to come up with recommendations. He basically had two. After months of study, he said we should be mechanically thinning our forest, that is, logging in our forest, and secondly, return to the 10 a.m. policy. What are the downstream effects of bad Forest Service management? First of all, we're losing the habitat for millions of species. We're burning millions of species in the fire. These are endangered species sometimes, but otherwise just we're killing lots of animals. But also we're destroying a watershed. In New Mexico, in this Whitewater Baldy fire, the forest around one of the lakes there that provides drinking water for Alamogordo was at risk. The Forest Service said they should clean it, and instead lawsuits were filed to stop that. The fire burned right up to the edge of the lake. The lake now has 50 feet of fill in it. All the fish are dead, starved for oxygen, exactly like the gentlelady from Wyoming said. The streams are now filling with silt. Forest Service personnel tell us that we'll be having to empty that lake for the next 15 years. 15 years of dead fish, 15 years downstream facing flooding, 15 years without the drinking water that sustains a community of about 30,000. These are what we face. But also the West is starved for jobs because of Forest Service policy. The original Organic Act, the act that created the forest, the U.S. Forest Service, said that they should be logging to create local commerce and jobs, and they should be protecting the watershed. The U.S. Forest Service is negligent on both of the underlying reasons for their existence. We in the West are suffering lost educational opportunities, destroyed habitat, destroyed forests, and those forests will not grow back for 100 years, according to the Forest Service personnel. It's time for us to pass H.R. 1526. I support it and yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Now I'd like to recognize a gentleman from California, Mr. Lamafia.
Mr. Speaker, every year, rural America, especially the western states and areas like mine, Northern California, are in the news, not for something good, but for something like we see going on with so many of the wildfires going on around the country. And there's no reason for this. That's why I support this bill here today that would actually make our forests perform for us instead of being a detriment to us and our health in California and the western states. We can have either the type of air quality problems that are happening like in the Central Valley of California, for example. One of my colleagues was talking about, although they've had challenges there in recent years, they've actually improved things. The air quality right now is much worse because of these fires than anything going on by people or by after the improvements that have gone on with other air quality issues. My own part of the state, back in 2008, the whole summer and into the fall, brown, dirty air, including the areas close to the fire, where kids couldn't go outside because the quality was 10 times above health levels for them to be safe. We see our small communities that are devastated by an economy that has been shifted away due to forest management and Forest Service policies that don't work for them. This legislation would allow our forests to perform for us and help these economies, help the health of the forest, the health of the people, and the health of the local economies to be strong once again, and, as was mentioned earlier, our rural schools. So let's do common sense legislation instead of watching our forests burn. I urge you to support this, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, for 30 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Speaker, this is an extraordinarily busy week in Washington as we have all returned from a district work period. There are many, many issues to discuss, including how we're going to fund the federal budget, get the fiscal house in order, potentially have the right type of tax reform, and deal with a whole host of other issues. But I felt like it would be very, very inadequate if the evening did not go by to delve into a little bit deeper of a discussion as to the nature of the Syrian conflict and the potential for United States military involvement. Mr. Speaker, I wrote my constituents last week as they expressed tremendous concern about the potential for U.S. entanglement in the situation in Syria. In fact, it's overwhelming, the number of people who have shared deep, heartfelt concerns. It is overwhelming, and I'm hearing that from my colleagues as well. And this is not some sort of populist reaction to the elites of this institution in government. It is an intuition of the American people who are suggesting to us in leadership that we have poured ourselves out as a country, sacrificed tremendously, extraordinarily to give other peoples a chance for stability, for human rights, for the right forms of development, for political outcomes that uphold just governing structures. And where have we gotten for our investment? You see, since World War II, basically the United States has been cast into the role of the superpower, being the proprietor of international stability, and we've accepted that arrangement. But there are tremendous, tremendous pressures upon us as we continue to move forward in the 21st century. As we've empowered other peoples and other economies through appropriate development to take responsibilities for themselves. The United States has not always done this perfectly, but we've fought multiple wars and we've engaged in many, many areas of the world in order to try to give other people a chance and to stop aggressive ideologies that are inconsistent with basic and fundamental human rights. So I responded to the people of Nebraska, and Mr. Speaker, I wanted to share that with you this evening. Life in Syria today is, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes once wrote, nasty, brutish, and short. An ongoing civil war rages in the country. The oppressive regime of President Bashar al-Assad wages battle against a nebulous, undefined mix of rebels who have regularly employed the same brutal violence that the government has. The result is that there are more than 100,000 persons dead, many innocent civilians, mothers, fathers, and children. In response to the suspected use of chemical weapons by Assad, President Obama is now advocating U.S. military intervention, although, of course, the situation is now fluid. In the past, he has stated that the use of chemical weapons is a, quote, red line that Assad could not cross without a serious rethinking of American involvement in the conflict, which to this point has included a significant amount of humanitarian aid, and properly so, targeted to those caught in the middle of this violence. The President, to his credit, has rightly asked for a vote of Congress prior to taking military action, and some in Congress are signaling their support. In recent days, however, I have clearly stated my opposition to this idea. I oppose this action of unilateral military strikes. The United States should not bomb Syria in the name of stopping violence in Syria. While quick unilateral military strikes might satisfy the President's red line rhetoric, the collateral damage and further risk of destabilization is very, very high. Now, as Congress has returned to Washington this week, there are hard questions that are in the process of being asked. What will be the consequences of this bombing? Who's on the other side of this? And how much do we really know of this rebel movement that we will be implicitly aiding if we attack Assad's government? What happens following the military strikes? Why not expend the energy of this debate over military involvement on solidifying international outrage and holding particularly Russia, a longtime ally of Syria who is entangled in this situation, holding them accountable? The international community must work together to creatively stop the savagery of Assad, but it cannot hide behind the United States military might. No longer can it be assumed that the United States is responsible for fixing all aspects of global conflicts. And no longer should the United States accept that framework. For the sake of global stability, a new construct must instead take its place, one in which the responsible nations of the world are serious about their own defense and stabilization of conflicts within their regions. In light of the increasing brutality in Syria, the United States should continue to advance its support for the innocent victims of this civil war. Meanwhile, we should also aggressively use this opportunity to facilitate new international partnerships that seek lasting solutions to complicated situations of mass violence. Until such a united front is achieved, unilateral military action may only introduce further chaos to an already disastrous problem, and as I have said, implicitly put us on the side of a rebel movement who has also shown willingness to murder innocent civilians. And it is not clear whether or not the more moderate elements of that very movement have any capacity to implement governing structures that are just and lasting. So then what happens? Syria, this area, degrades into a vast, ungovernable space, ripe for jihadists, with no protection for innocent persons, or the ancient peoples who call that place home. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of other aspects of this that I've written about that I'd like to share momentarily. But I'd like to turn to my good friend, Congressman Charlie Dent from Pennsylvania, as he wishes to share a few concepts and perspectives on this conflict.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Nebraska for organizing this special order this evening to discuss this